The most radical critiques of capitalism in the West began the first wave. Let's call them waves. The first wave was inequality. The critique was that our contemporary economic and political system generates inequalities and unfair inequalities. People with money can make more money. People without stay at the bottom of the pile. So, that's very simple. We still know that critique today. But around the Second World War and just after the Second World War, intellectuals in Europe began to critique this dominant Western ideology, not so much in terms of inequality, although that was part of it, but in terms of repression. So what you got was really insightful analysis of how our society creates one-dimensional individuals, people who become like a cog in the system. So if you look at the great literature from the kind of mid-20th century onwards, there's a lot of that literature which is exploring either how bureaucracy grinds people down, how industries make us into just part of a huge machine, and how we become, in a sense, detached from our wider desires and interests. So even like films like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, I think, goes into it, but creates this vision of a world which runs without a soul, without that which makes us human. So the first wave of critique, looked at primarily inequalities. The second wave, you could say, looked at repression and looked at how contemporary ideology, contemporary economics can reduce us all to kind of economic players and reduce us all to small parts in a massive system, in a massive machine that takes away our individuality and takes away our humanity. And then the third wave, which I think is just beginning to take shape, is the critique that actually our system runs on this obsessive connection with what we can call a lost object. Now, to understand what this lost object is, we start with, imagine someone who is a hypochondriac and who has this sense of dis-ease in themselves. So they have these feelings, they have these fears, and they attach those feelings and those fears onto a belief that they have cancer. So this particular hypochondriac thinks that they have some sort of cancer. And then they imagine that things would be so much better if they didn't have the cancer. So on the other side of the cancer might be, good relationships with their family, a job. It might be, just a peaceful life. So what you have psychologically is a person who is imagining something wonderful that is impossible to get because of an obstacle, the obstacle being cancer. And that obstacle is causing dis-ease and a feeling of dissatisfaction and fear and anxiety in their life. But from a psychoanalytic perspective, something more interesting is taking place. What you could say is that the hypochondriac here has this trauma, the trauma of life itself, and maybe particular contingent traumas as well that have happened to them. And what they've done is they've placed all of that angst and anxiety and fear into an object, cancer. So they can say it's the cancer that causes all of these feelings, but it's not the cancer that causes the feelings. It's actually the cancer that allows the hypochondriac to stay on top of their feelings, to not drown in their trauma, to not be overcome by their anxiety. And this obstacle, this thing, the cancer, which they think is the cause of their dis-ease, but is actually that which allows them to distance themselves from their dis-ease, creates the illusion that there is something just past the cancer that would be wonderful and amazing and incredible, that would make their life one of peace and tranquility. Now, the cancer can be seen as a type of scapegoat. It's something that is imagined as getting in the way of some sort of perfection, but it actually creates the illusion that there is some sort of perfection. Now, the difference between a hypochondriac who thinks they have cancer, right? And then let's imagine that this hypochondriac actually finds out that they do have cancer. They're still a hypochondriac. I don't know if you know the phrase, just because you're paranoid, it doesn't mean they're not out to get you. Which means, this is a Lacanian idea actually, that you're still paranoid. You know, if you're paranoid that the FBI are looking for you, and it turns out that they actually are, you're paranoid, but you just have empirical evidence that can kind of cover it over, make it look like you're normal. So the difference between a hypochondriac who has cancer and somebody else who has cancer is the person who's not a hypochondriac, they don't need the cancer. Now, it sounds weird, but the hypochondriac needs the cancer. They need the idea of the cancer. Whereas somebody else who finds out they have the disease, they don't need it. And because they don't need it, they can, probably be more effective at, fighting it. So even if the hypochondriac fights the cancer and gets over it, they will likely be fearful of its return or think that it's not really gone. Because whereas in the normal person, it's contingent, they just happen to have cancer, the hypochondriac, in a sense, requires it. They need it. Now, this is interesting because it can help us understand the difference between psychotherapy and psychoanalysis. And by the way, these are interconnected, and there are lots of psychotherapists who are also psychoanalysts, and people who use both techniques. But broadly speaking, psychotherapy, has this idea that people want to get better, right? Just like if you break your arm, your body will naturally heal if it's given the right environment, because that's what it wants to do. The bones naturally want to, rejoin. As long as you've got a cast, it will happen. In the same way, someone's got a problem in their relationship, or they've got a problem in their job, and so they go to a psychotherapist, and the psychotherapist listens. They help them work through their feelings, and maybe even gives them advice about what they should do in order to, improve their life and get back on their feet. The difference between that and psychoanalysis sounds kind of weird at first, because psychoanalysis works on the premise that at key moments we don't want to get better, that actually at our core we don't want to get well, and that there are resistances every step of the way whenever we are looking to find a cure, to get over misery, to get over melancholy, to get over obsessive compulsions and repetitions of bad actions. Now, to understand what that means, and Freud called this the death drive, that in some senses we fight against the healing process. And so in psychoanalysis, it's always about trying to unearth these resistances, to try to make sure that they don't halt the healing process. Now, Lacan, the psychoanalyst, he explored this in depth. And one of the ways to understand why we do want to get better is because, take this hypochondriac as an example. To get better means to lose the scapegoat, which means losing also the sacred object, the lost object, the thing that you think will make everything great, and actually confront the crises and the traumas and the difficulties of your life. And that can be so terrifying that we would prefer to remain in the thrall of the illusion that there is something out there that will fix it all. So in psychoanalytic terms, take the example of a gambler. People think that gamblers are addicted to winning, but often gamblers are actually addicted to losing. Because in losing, the idea that there is a win that would just make everything fine, that would just fix everything, remains. You know, if a gambler kept winning the slot machines, well, then they would kind of discover that actually winning has no real power. But as long as they keep losing, as they lose, they retain the fantasy of something that will fix them. And that fantasy can help prevent us from looking at the traumas and the pains and the difficulties in the gambler's life. There's an example of a friend of mine who was in psychoanalysis, and he was telling the psychoanalyst about a relationship that he was in. And he said it was like a heroin relationship, up and down, like real highs and lows. And, you know, it was incredible when they were together, but it was an impossible relationship. And you know, he just said, I'm addicted to the highs. I'm just addicted to the highs of this relationship. And the analyst, who, you know, would rarely say anything, just said, what if you're addicted to the lows? Now, when she said that, my friend had a realization that actually, by never having a real relationship with this woman, he was able to maintain a fantasy that if he was with her, everything would be wonderful, everything would be great. So even though he was suffering from not having this relationship, the suffering allowed him a fantasy of wholeness just over the horizon. And that prevented him from having to look at the difficulties in his life. So yeah, I mentioned the hypochondriac, the gambler. I've just mentioned, you know, the heroin relationship. One other example, another true example is there's a comedian I know who was going to a therapist, and you know, he just got married, and he wasn't. He was anxious about it. He wasn't happy. He felt dissatisfied in the relationship, and he was thinking about adultery. And the analyst said to him, because he felt guilty about this, the analyst said, don't take adultery off the table. Now, at first, this seems counterintuitive. But what the analyst is saying is, well, you know, you're dissatisfied and you have this suffering in your life. And then you create a scapegoat, which is your wife. You know, oh, if only my wife wasn't there, you know, I could have another relationship. Maybe it would be so much better. It would be great. It would be fantastic. And with that scapegoat, you now then have a fantasy of a lost object, something that would be incredible and amazing and would fix everything. And he said, so the analyst said, so if you get rid of the adultery, like if you put it off the table, you just make it more powerful, because you make the impossibility, you make the scapegoat even bigger. Oh, I can't have an affair, which makes the scapegoat even more impossible. I can't have an affair because of her, because, you know, it would hurt everybody, and so I can't do it. And the strength of that I can't do it, will just feed the idea that there is something beyond that prohibition, which is fantastic. So this lost object will be invested libidinally with even more power than before. So by keeping adultery on the table, he's saying, well, look at it. Why do you want to have adultery? Why do you want to commit it? Let's talk it through. Let's see what that is hiding. Let's look at the scapegoat and see what that's telling you about yourself. Let's start to look at the struggles that you're hiding from. So in a stereotypical fascist kind of right-wing group, you have you know, the figure of the Jew, the Jewish community. They're the problem. So they're the scapegoat. So what you have is a community that's feeling a crisis. There is a problem. And that experience is then put onto the Jewish community. They are the problem. So it's concretized. Just like someone who's phobic about mice, they have a general anxiety and then they concretize it into some object, spiders or mice or whatever it is. So the fascist community have this sense of dis-ease and trauma. They scapegoat it, put it onto the Jewish community, And then they fantasize a lost object on the other side of that. If we only got rid of the Jewish community, then everything would be better. We would return to the land, we'd get rid of like abstraction, we would have control back of the banks and the media and the education system that have been stolen from us, all of these kind of ideas. But actually, the fascist needs the Jewish community as much as the hypochondriac needs their cancer. Because if you got rid of the Jewish community, all you'd discover is that there is no lost object. And actually, the crisis that you thought was the fault of the other is inherent to yourself.